These three disturbing park ranger horror stories about rescues gone wrong are inspired by real events. First, a fallen runner thinks she's found salvation when a ranger arrives, but quickly realizes his medical aid is actually a cover for something sinister. Next, a hero's daring blizzard rescue unravels when a single impossible detail in the evidence suggests he wasn't saving a human at all. And finally, a cliffside extraction turns violent when the stranded hiker fights the ranger, desperate to avoid being rescued. Make sure you watch until the very end to find out the bone-chilling reason why the victim was terrified of being found alive. They said she was lucky to be alive after the fall shattered her legs. But when she woke up in the hospital and saw the x-rays, the doctors quietly told her the breaks were too clean, too deliberate, more like someone had crushed her bones one by one and blamed it on the mountain. You have to understand the terrain up in the trough on Long's Peak to get why Judson was in trouble. It isn't just a hiking trail. It's a steep, nasty couloir at 13,000 feet, a chute filled with loose rock and gravel that shifts every time you breathe. Judson wasn't up there for the scenery. She was a trail runner, one of those high-altitude obsessives who treats gravity like a suggestion. She was chasing a personal best on the Keyhole route, moving fast and light. She wasn't carrying a heavy pack or survival gear. She was stripped down to running shorts, a thin wind shell, and shoes that looked more like socks with tread. She was making incredible time, lungs burning in the thin air, adrenaline masking the exhaustion. But that speed is exactly what killed her. She was pounding up the scree, fighting for traction, when her watch beeped a mile split. It was just a reflex. She glanced down at her wrist to check her pace, breaking her rhythm for a fraction of a second. In that moment of distraction, she planted her left foot wrong. A rock the size of a grapefruit rolled under her tread. Because she was moving so fast, the momentum didn't just trip her, it launched her. She tumbled about 40 feet down the steep incline. It wasn't one of those movie falls where you fly through the air. It was a violent, ugly slide against jagged granite and hard-packed dirt. She slammed into a thick root protruding from the hillside, and that's what stopped her. It knocked the wind out of her so hard she lay there for a full minute, just gasping, trying to force her lungs to expand in the freezing, thin air. When the dust settled, she took stock. It hurt, yeah, but it wasn't a death sentence. Her left ankle was sprained bad, throbbing with that hot, sick pulse that tells you running is over. Her ribs felt like someone had taken a baseball bat to them, and she was scraped raw on her arms and legs. But the real problem was the cold. She was dressed for high-output cardio, not for sitting still on a 13,000-foot rock face. As soon as her sweat started to dry, the hypothermia clock started ticking. She dragged her hydration vest over and fished out her phone. The screen was smashed, a spider web of cracks over the glass, but the backlight still flickered on. She dialed 911. You know how the service is in the park. Garbage. The call connected, but the operator's voice was barely there, just a tinny insect noise cutting through a wall of static. Judson managed to shout her location, repeating the trough twice before the signal died completely. She dropped the phone in the dirt. She'd done her part. Now she just had to wait for the system to work. Sunlight started to fade behind the peaks. Shadows stretched out across the rock, turning everything gray. Judson sat there, teeth chattering violently, hugging her knees to her chest to conserve heat. That's when she heard boots. Heavy treads crunching on gravel. Fast, confident. Not the light patter of another runner, but the heavy stomp of authority. "Hello?" a voice called down from the ridge. It was calm, deep. "I'm Ranger Black. I'm already in the area. We got a ping about a fall." Judson nearly cried with relief. Seeing that gray uniform appear on the ridge was like seeing an angel. Ranger Black lowered himself down the slope with practiced ease. He didn't scramble. He moved like he owned the mountain. He was soft-spoken, checking her pulse and looking over her legs with gentle hands. "You're lucky," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Nothing looks completely broken. We'll get you out of here with a few bruises and a good story." He pulled a radio off his belt, a heavy-duty handheld. He keyed the mic to call it in, but all that came out was a burst of static. He frowned, adjusted the squelch, and tried again. Nothing but white noise. "We're having trouble with the repeater up here," he said, glancing at the darkening sky. "Listen, you're dressed for running, not camping. But the slope is too unstable to bring a carry-out team down in the dark. It's safer if I stabilize you here. We'll move at first light." Judson wanted to argue. She was freezing. She wanted a team. She wanted out. But he was the ranger. He was the expert. She watched him open his medical kit. It was organized perfectly. "I'm going to give you something for the pain," he said, uncapping a syringe. "It's going to make you sleepy, but you need to relax. Your muscles are locking up from the cold." She didn't ask what was in it. She just nodded. When he injected her, the relief was almost instant. But it was heavy. Her vision started to blur at the edges, like someone smeared grease on a camera lens. The sounds of the mountain, the wind, the shifting rock got muffled, like she was hearing them from underwater. Ranger Black was the only thing sharp and clear in her world. Night settled in. True dark. The kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. Ranger Black clicked on a headlamp. The beam cut through the dust. "I need to reposition this leg," he told her. "Check the fracture site." He moved slow. He grabbed her calf with both hands. His grip was strong. Too strong. Then he twisted. It wasn't a medical adjustment. It was leverage. Judson heard a sound that made her stomach turn over. A loud, wet crack. It sounded like snapping a green branch in half. A bolt of white-hot lightning shot up her leg, tearing right through the drug haze. She screamed. It was a ragged, desperate noise that echoed off the canyon walls. Ranger Black flinched back, looking shocked. "Slope shifted under us, Judson," he said, his voice dropping to that calm, soothing tone. "You felt that, right?" The scree gave way. "That wasn't me." Judson lay there, gasping, tears leaking out of her eyes. Her brain was swimming in chemicals, but a small part of her knew the truth. The slope hadn't shifted. The ground hadn't moved an inch. She had felt his hands. She had felt him do it. He didn't give her time to process it. "We have to immobilize the fracture," he said, urgency in his voice now. He started wrapping a splint around her lower leg. He pulled the straps tight. Way too tight. The plastic dug into her swelling skin. When she whimpered, he leaned in close, right by her ear. "Shh," he whispered. "We have to immobilize it. It'll hurt now, but it'll save the limb." Time lost its meaning after that. Judson drifted in and out, floating on a sea of narcotics, only to be yanked back to shore by spikes of agony. The accidents kept happening. Through the fog, she saw him brace her foot against a smooth, gray rock. He used the stone for leverage. He looked her right in the eye, face totally blank. "Need to push on the knee," he said. "Check stability." He pushed hard. Another snap. This one was different, drier, brittle. It sounded like a gunshot inside her own body. The pain was blinding, paralyzing her lungs so she couldn't even scream. He pulled his hands back immediately, spouting off a stream of technical words. "Tibial stress," he muttered, shaking his head like it was a tragedy. "Microfractures. Bone density must be compromised." He was building a wall of jargon to hide behind. But Judson realized then, with a sick clarity, what was happening. The fall hadn't broken her legs. Ranger Black was creating the injuries he was narrating. He wasn't stabilizing her. He was breaking her. Systematically. Later, he noticed a large bruise forming on her thigh. He reached into his kit and pulled out a scalpel. The blade glinted in the headlamp beam. "Need to relieve swelling," he mumbled. "Prevent compartment syndrome. Have to open it up." His voice had changed. It wasn't the professional ranger voice anymore. It was thicker, heavier. He sounded pleased. He sounded like a man enjoying a good meal. He sliced the skin, a clean, precise line. Judson couldn't move. She was trapped in her own useless body, a spectator to her own butchery. He pressed his fingers deep into the tender, pulsing tissue. He found the pressure points. He held them. He watched her face twist up in the darkness. His breathing got heavy, slow, deep. In the quiet of that ravine, it was the only sound she could hear. She passed out after that, just couldn't take it anymore. Morning came with a different sound, the heavy beat of rotors, a helicopter. Judson opened her eyes. The sun was just hitting the peaks. Ranger Black was standing over her. He looked different. He'd smeared dirt on his face. He looked exhausted. He looked like a hero who had been up all night fighting to save a life. A rescue team was coming down the slope. An actual team. They were responding to Judson's original 911 ping, not Ranger Black's radio. "She took a hell of a tumble," Black told the lead medic, wiping sweat off his forehead. "Legs are a mess. Runner, no gear. I did what I could to stabilize the fractures in the dark, but it was rough." He guided them around the site. He pointed to the rocks. He described her fall path in detail, making sure the physical evidence on the ground matched the carnage he had inflicted on her body. He controlled the story before she could even speak. They loaded her up. The flight to the hospital was a blur. But lies have a way of falling apart under bright lights. Dr. Sharma was the orthopedic surgeon on call. She'd been putting hikers back together for 20 years. She spent a long time looking at Judson's x-rays. She didn't say anything at first. She just traced the lines of the breaks on the screen, frowning. She came into Judson's room and closed the door. She pulled a chair up close. "These breaks," Dr. Sharma said, keeping her voice low. "They don't make sense for a fall. They're at different angles, different force levels." She pointed to the image of the lower leg. "The thinner bones here, they're broken too cleanly. And these cuts, they're precision cuts. If I didn't know better, I'd say someone did this systematically. This looks intentional." Judson started crying. She told the doctor everything. She told the park administrators. She told the police. She described the wet crack of the bone, the heavy breathing, the fake radio calls. But when you go up against a hero, you usually lose. The administration was hesitant. Ranger Black had a file thick with commendations. He had glowing reviews from people he'd saved. They looked at his record and they looked at Judson, a traumatized woman on heavy pain meds, and they shrugged. They chalked it up to trauma fog. They said pain changes your memory. But Dr. Sharma's diagnosis had planted a seed. Judson couldn't let it go. Once she was out of the hospital, wheelchair-bound and scarred, she started digging. She didn't have access to the official files. They keep those locked up tight. But she didn't need a badge to find the truth. She had a laptop and a lot of sleepless nights in that chair. Heroes like Black, they make the papers. She dug through digital newspaper archives, searching for Rescue and his name. She scrolled back 5 years on local hiking forums and Facebook groups. She watched every grainy local news clip she could find online. The pattern was there. You just had to look for it. Every single one of his tough saves made the news because of how brutal they were. The injuries were always unusually severe compared to the accident report. A guy slips on a trail and ends up with 2 shattered kneecaps. A woman trips and ends up with compound fractures in both arms. Every victim was badly mangled, but in every interview, they were grateful just to be alive. And here's the kicker. Almost all of them mentioned foggy memories of the night before the carryout. They remembered Ranger Black being there. They remembered his kindness. They remembered his voice. But they didn't remember how they got broken. Ranger Black is still out there. He's still got his badge. He's still patrolling the Rockies. And somewhere, right now, the sun is going down, the signal is dying, and he's waiting for someone to try and beat their best time. Ranger Vance became a local hero for saving a lost teenager, Tanner, in a blizzard. Until Ranger O'Connell noticed that the rescue photos in the newspaper didn't match the weather report. The hospital had no record of the kid, and Vance's own body cam showed him talking to an empty, snow-covered stretcher. The night Ranger Vance walked through the double doors of the station, the room didn't just clap, it exploded. The station hadn't been this loud in years. For months, the department had been a morgue of bad news, budget cuts, layoffs, and a string of failed searches that left the break room quiet and the coffee tasting like ash. They were desperate for a win. They were starving for it. And when Vance kicked the snow off his boots, looking exhausted, rugged, and alive, he fed them exactly what they needed. Ranger O'Connell was the first one out of her chair. She had 20 years on the job, a hardened veteran who didn't impress easily. But that night, she felt a lump in her throat. She grabbed Vance's hand, shaking it hard. His grip was firm, his skin cold from the storm. "You did it," she said, her voice thick with genuine pride. "You actually brought him home." Vance smiled, a tired, humble grin that made everyone in the room want to buy him a drink. He didn't brag. He just nodded, wiping wet snow from his eyebrows. "Team effort," he said softly, though everyone knew he had gone out alone. "Just glad the kid is safe." The atmosphere in the station transformed instantly. The dread of the layoffs evaporated. Rookies were high-fiving. The dispatch commander was actually smiling. O'Connell watched Vance hold court in the center of the room, recounting the details of the trek. She felt a profound sense of camaraderie. This was why they did the job. This was the comfort zone of the service, the feeling that when things got bad, they could conquer the elements. Vance was the embodiment of that hope. He was the hero they all wanted to be. O'Connell thought back to the rescue itself, replaying it in her mind with admiration. She had been on dispatch when the call came in. A concerned citizen had phoned the non-emergency line, reporting a missing 16-year-old named Tanner. Vance had been on patrol and took the lead without hesitation. "I'm closest," he had radioed. "I'm going in." O'Connell remembered the tension in the comms room as Vance patched the phone call through to the speakers. It was a masterclass in crisis management. They could all hear the kid, Tanner, whimpering on the other end of the line. "I can't feel my hands," the boy had sobbed, his voice thin and terrified. "It's so white. I can't see the trail." The entire dispatch team had frozen, helpless. But Vance was the anchor. His voice cut through the static, calm and commanding. "Hold on, Tanner," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm almost there. Keep talking to me. Don't you close your eyes." O'Connell had closed her own eyes, praying. She listened as Vance described the conditions deteriorating. "Visibility is dropping to 0, he shouted, the wind howling in his mic. "I'm pushing through 2 feet of drifts here. It's a total whiteout. When the call finally came, "Got him! He's unresponsive but breathing. Loading him now!" The relief in the dispatch room was physical. O'Connell had slumped back in her chair, letting out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for hours. Vance hadn't just saved a kid. He had saved the department's spirit. The high lasted until the next morning. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page, "Hero in the Storm." O'Connell sat in the break room, the morning sun streaming in, feeling good. She picked up the paper, smiling at the photo of Vance standing by the ambulance, looking stoic. She sipped her coffee. She looked at the photo again, and then she frowned. It was a small thing, a wrong detail. In the photo, Vance looked frozen, but the snow on the shoulders of his heavy tactical jacket, it was melting. It was wet, translucent slush soaking into the fabric. O'Connell paused. Vance had reported sub-zero temperatures. He had reported a hard freeze and whiteout conditions. If he had just walked out of a blizzard that intense, the snow on his gear should have been dry, crusted ice. It should have clung to the nylon like concrete. This looked like the wet, heavy slop you get on a mild afternoon. Maybe the ambulance bay was heated, she told herself. Maybe it melted fast. She tried to push the doubt away. She wanted to push it away. She liked Vance. She liked the victory. But the seed of wrongness had been planted. Later that afternoon, the news station aired the B-roll footage. The reporter's voice was dramatic, talking about the life-or-death struggle. But the footage behind the anchor was stock video of a raging blizzard, heavy, thick flakes falling sideways. O'Connell looked out the window. The sky was a flat, boring gray. Gary, the volunteer weather enthusiast who kept the park's meteorological logs, walked by with a clipboard. "Hey, Gary," O'Connell asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Did we really get hammered that hard in the North Sector last night? Vance made it sound like Armageddon." Gary stopped. He looked confused. "North Sector? No. Radar showed light flurries. Maybe a dusting. Visibility was 5 miles plus all night." O'Connell felt a cold prickle on the back of her neck. The warmth of the camaraderie began to drain out of the room. "Are you sure?" "I'm looking at the data right now," Gary said, tapping his pen. "Why would he say it was a whiteout?" The suspicion wasn't a wave, it was a slow, suffocating tide. O'Connell went back to her desk. She didn't want to be right. She wanted to be wrong. But she was a ranger, and rangers looked for tracks. She pulled the incident report. She wanted to see the kid. She wanted to see Tanner's face, to prove to herself that the boy was real. The file was thin. There were no photos, just a note from Vance. Family requested total privacy. No press contact. Possible, but convenient. O'Connell picked up the phone. She dialed the local hospital intake. She knew the nurse, Sarah. "Hey, checking on the Tanner kid," O'Connell said, her voice tight. "The hypothermia case Vance brought in." "O'Connell," Sarah said, sounding bored. "We didn't admit a hypothermia case last night. We had a broken arm and a stomach bug. No Tanner." "He said he brought him in critical," O'Connell pressed, her knuckles white. "We're the only ER for 50 miles, Sarah replied. "If he came in, he'd be here. He isn't." O'Connell hung up. The station, which had been filled with cheers yesterday, now felt like a stage set, a fake world built on a lie. She looked across the room at Vance. He was on the phone, laughing, retelling the story to a donor. He didn't look like a hero anymore. He looked like an actor. She had to see the footage. She logged into the server and pulled Vance's body cam file. She put on her headphones. The video started. Vance was walking through the woods. The snow was shallow, barely covering the soles of his boots. He was calling out, "Tanner! Tanner!" into the dark trees. He reached a gully. He dragged the rescue sled out from behind a boulder. And then, O'Connell watched the performance of a madman. Vance stood over the empty sled. He was shouting into his radio, breathless, panicked. "I've got him! Staying with me, Tanner! Stay with me!" But on the screen, there was no Tanner. There was just snow and rocks. Vance was performing CPR on the air. He was counting compressions. 1, 2, 3, looking intently at the ground, but his hands were at his sides. He was saving a ghost. Then, the glitch. A solid 10-minute block of black silence right when he would have been loading the body. When the video cut back in, the sled was covered with a tarp. Vance was dragging it, claiming the kid was underneath. The sled bounced over a root. It bounced lightly, like an empty plastic shell. O'Connell felt sick, not just because of the lie, but because of how easily she had swallowed it. She cornered him that evening in the supply room, away from the others. She laid it out, the weather, the hospital, the empty video. She watched his face, expecting the mask to crumble. She expected him to apologize, to beg. But Vance didn't blink. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, dead stare. "The family lives off-grid," he said, his voice flat. "That's why the records are weird. And the camera? Data corruption. It happens." "There is no Tanner," O'Connell whispered. "I traced the initial call, Vance. Maintenance found the burner phone in the bathroom trash can. It links to your personal number." Vance stepped closer. The hero was gone. "You're jealous," he sneered. "People needed a win, O'Connell. I gave them one. Who is the victim here? Nobody got hurt. Everyone felt good. I provided a service." "It was a lie," she said. Internal Affairs arrived the next morning. They searched his locker. They searched his truck. But the true horror wasn't found at the station. It was found in his remote cabin, miles deep in the woods. Inside a locked box, Vance kept an archive. It wasn't just clippings of his own fake rescue. It was a study of death. There were dozens of articles about real tragedies in the park. Drownings, falls, avalanche burials. He had circled the names. He had highlighted the descriptions of the bodies. And next to them were the scripts. Notebooks filled with handwriting. Scenario 14, Cave Collapse. Scenario 22, River Extraction. Every line of dialogue was written out. Every radio call rehearsed. "I need a medevac now." "He's bleeding out." But the last folder, the one marked Authenticity, was the one that made O'Connell's blood run cold. It described a problem. Fake victims lack visceral response. Screams are unconvincing. And the solution: use a localized asset, a tourist, someone solitary. The notes detailed a plan to lead a real person into a dangerous sector, to disable them, to leave them there, exposed to the elements for 6 to 8 hours, just long enough to bring them to the brink of death. Vance was quietly removed, the scandal buried to save the department's reputation. O'Connell stayed on the desk. She tried to tell herself it was over. She tried to tell herself they caught him in time. A week later, late on a Tuesday night, the phone rang. The station was empty. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows. O'Connell picked up the receiver. "Ranger Station, this is O'Connell." There was silence on the other end, then static. And through the static, a voice. It was sobbing. Is he coming?" O'Connell froze. "Who is this?" "This is Jessica," the voice whimpered. "Jessica from the campsite. He told me to wait here. He told me to wait until I couldn't feel my legs anymore." O'Connell's eyes darted to the evidence box on her desk, to the photocopy of the notebook page labeled Scenario 18, hypothermia. Subject name, Jessica. "Who told you to wait?" O'Connell asked, her hand trembling as she reached for the radio mic. "Ranger Vance," the girl sobbed, her voice slurring with cold. "He promised he'd come for me. He said this time it would be real." O'Connell gripped the desk. Vance was gone, but the play had already started. "Jessica, listen to me," O'Connell said, her voice shaking. "Stay exactly where you are. I'm coming to get you. I'm coming right now." Ranger Becker crawled 3 miles out on a bad shoulder to save a stranded man, Holt, from a collapsing ridge. But the hiker fought him so violently, kicking, clawing, trying to drag them both over the edge, that the ranger only understood why when the man confessed he was already dead on paper, before vanishing into the woods and leaving Becker with a mystery he could never solve. It hadn't started as a nightmare. It started with the dull, rhythmic ache in Becker's left shoulder, a reminder of the firewood he had spent the last 2 hours stacking. That shoulder had been wrecked years ago in a climbing accident, a mess of scar tissue and stiff joints that flared up whenever the weather turned or the work got too heavy. He was standing on the porch of the ranger station, rubbing the sore muscle, watching the sun dip below the tree line. He was ready for a hot shower, a cold beer, and the mindless comfort of the evening news. Then the radio on his belt crackled to life, shattering the peace of the evening. It was dispatch, relaying a 911 call that had just come in. Becker listened to the recording, and immediately the hair on the back of his neck stood up. The voice on the line was male, tight and thin, like a wire pulled until it was ready to snap. The caller claimed he had a bad injury, possibly a broken ankle, and was stranded on a rough section of the trail. But something about the call was wrong. It was too precise. Most people in a crisis are messy. They panic. They scream about trees and rocks and pain. They don't know where they are. This guy was different. He knew his mileage down to the decimal point. "I'm about 5 miles out on the Devil's Tooth Trail," the voice hissed through the static. Then came the demand that made Becker's stomach twist. "Just send one guy, okay? Please don't send a whole circus." Becker stared at the radio, the strange request echoing in the small room. People screaming for rescue don't usually worry about keeping the operation low-key. They want helicopters. They want sirens. They want the world to know they are in trouble. This man sounded like he was ordering a pizza he didn't want anyone to know about. It didn't sound like a cry for help. It sounded like a negotiation. Becker sighed, the pain in his shoulder throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He was built for this work. You don't get to be a park ranger by being squeamish or lazy. But his gut twisted just thinking about that specific set of coordinates. The Devil's Tooth wasn't popular for a reason. It was unstable, a jagged spine of loose rock and sheer drop-offs that locals avoided. He went to his locker and loaded the heavy-gauge rope, a basic medical kit, and his own canteen. He checked his knots. He checked his lights. He told himself it was just a twisted ankle, just a weird guy who didn't like crowds. But deep down, he knew he was walking into something complicated. The hike in was miserable. It was 3 miles of steady, unforgiving incline that put a slow, grinding pressure on his bad shoulder. With every step up the rocky path, the joint clicked and popped, sending hot spikes of pain down his arm. Becker grit his teeth and kept moving, his boots crunching loudly on the dry leaves. As he moved closer to the coordinates, the natural atmosphere of the forest began to change. It got profoundly, unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of the deep woods, the rustle of squirrels, the distant call of a raven, the wind in the pines, simply vanished. It was a dead silence. It was heavy, like the air itself had solidified into lead. Every step Becker took sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. He found himself checking his back constantly, a deep, unsettled feeling rising in his chest like cold water. Then Becker started seeing the details that screamed, not accident, but intention. He stopped to examine a set of boot prints in the soft dirt. They showed a man walking a steady, even pace. There were no drag marks, no signs of staggering from an injury. The pattern of prints led up a rise, and then suddenly stopped right at a section of the ridge that was actively giving way. It was the absolute worst, most unstable place on the whole mountain. It was a place you only went if you didn't care about coming back. A short distance before the ridge, Becker saw something that made him freeze. Tucked behind a large slab of gray rock was a hiker's worn backpack. It wasn't tossed aside in a panic or dropped during a fall. It was hidden. It was wedged carefully into a crevice concealed from view. Becker stared at the bag. People in shock dropped their gear. They prioritized survival. This guy had hidden his supplies. It suggested premeditation, a plan to disappear, which was a horrifying thought in a place this dangerous. The environment, which Becker usually trusted like a second skin, was starting to feel fundamentally wrong. He moved carefully to the edge of the drop-off. Finally, he spotted the man. The man who had given the name Holt was sitting on a thin, dangerous ledge about 20 feet down. He had a nasty, bleeding scrape on his lower leg, but he wasn't flailing. He wasn't yelling for help. He was just sitting there, calm as a statue, staring into the dizzying drop below him. He was dirty, covered in dust, but his clothes were intact. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like a man waiting for a bus at the end of the world. "Halt!" Becker shouted, his voice flat in the dead air. The man looked up slowly. When Becker uncoiled the rescue line and threw it down, the rope slapped against the rock face. Holt didn't grab it immediately. He hesitated. It was a long, deliberate pause that felt like an hour. He looked at the rope, then down at the abyss, then back at the rope. It was the look of a man trying to decide right then and there between two ways to end his life. The rescue line wasn't salvation. To him, it looked like a terrifying third option he desperately wanted to avoid. Finally, Holt grabbed the line. Becker secured the rope to a rock piton, his movements slow and deliberate to spare his aching shoulder. He began the difficult, focused work of guiding the man back across the treacherous ridge. But the second Becker clipped the metal harness onto Holt's body, the man exploded. It wasn't the sound of pain or fright. It was a terrified, chaotic rage. Holt launched himself backward, twisting and turning violently on the thick rope. He clawed at Becker's jacket with dirty fingernails. He drove his head into the ranger's chest, knocking the wind out of him. He wasn't trying to get free of the rope. He was actively trying to foul the line. He was trying to pull both of them off the mountain. "No!" Holt screamed, his voice shredding his throat. "I can't go back. You don't understand. You can't make me go back." He wasn't yelling about the sheer terror of falling. He wasn't screaming about the throbbing in his leg. He was yelling about being seen. "If they see me, it's over," Holt shrieked, his eyes wide and wild with a panic that made no sense. "The reports! The records! You don't understand what happens if I go back." Becker realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't a rescuer in this man's eyes. He was a threat. He was an agent of the state, a man with a badge and a clipboard. Becker represented the paperwork Holt was running from. They were on the narrowest part of the trail now, the ground crumbling away beneath their feet. Holt suddenly threw his full dead weight against the line, surging toward the drop. "Shh." The sound of the loose gravel giving way was dry and continuous as small rocks tumbled into the chasm. Becker's boots skidded on the shale. He scrambled for traction, but the ground was like marbles. He felt a violent wrench in his bad shoulder as the muscle tore. The pain was sharp and blinding, white spots dancing in his vision, but the thick rope held fast. Becker slammed his good arm against a rock to brace them, suspended by a shred of luck and years of training. For one terrible moment, suspended over the void, Becker had a crystal-clear thought. This man is choosing to kill me, to save himself from my help. Then, just as violently as it began, the struggle stopped. Holt looked up and saw the raw physical commitment on Becker's face. He saw the sweat, the gritted teeth, the desperate grimace of a man who was about to die for a stranger. The fight drained out of him instantly. He collapsed against the rock wall, sobbing, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Becker hauled him the last few feet onto safe ground. When they finally reached a level clearing, the intense taste of copper and raw fear was thick in Becker's mouth. Holt lay on the ground, trembling, his body rocking with the sudden crash of adrenaline. "My real name," Holt finally admitted, the words barely a whisper into the dirt. "It's Michael." Then, softly, he confessed the whole nightmare. He told Becker about the car crash 3 months ago, the body he burned to fake his death, and the insurance money. He explained that he was officially dead, living off the grid, and only called for help because he didn't want to die alone. Becker helped Michael to the truck. The drive back to the station was surreal. After the violence on the cliff, Michael had gone completely silent. He sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing trees, his face blank and eerily calm. He wasn't shaking anymore. He wasn't crying. He looked like a man who had accepted a fate he couldn't change. The silence in the cab was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. Becker kept glancing over, expecting another outburst. But Michael just watched the forest roll by, motionless as a corpse. When they pulled into the station lot, the sun was fully down. The floodlights cast long, sharp shadows across the pavement. Becker killed the engine. "Let's go inside," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We need to get that leg looked at." Michael nodded slowly. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. He stood there for a moment, looking at the ranger station, then at the patrol car, and then at the dark, dense tree line that bordered the parking lot. He was perfectly calm. Becker walked around the front of the truck, favoring his injured shoulder. "Come on," Becker said, reaching for his keys. In that split second, Michael moved. He didn't scream. He didn't attack. He simply turned and bolted. It was an explosive burst of speed straight toward the tree line. Becker shouted, taking a step to chase him, but his bad shoulder seized up, dropping him to his knees in the dirt. He watched, helpless, as Michael hit the edge of the woods. There was the sound of branches breaking, the thud of footsteps on soft earth, and then nothing. Just silence. The woods swallowed him whole. Becker stayed on his knees for a moment, breathing hard, the pain radiating through his chest. He knew he couldn't chase a desperate man through the dark in his condition. He slowly got up and walked into the empty station. The fluorescent lights hummed, cold and bright. Becker sat at his desk, his hand shaking as he pulled up the database. He needed to know who he had just lost. He needed to make sense of the last 3 hours. He typed the only name he had. Michael. He hit enter. The screen filled instantly. It wasn't one file. It was thousands. Michael Anderson, Michael Baker, Michael Carter, thousands of Michaels, missing persons, felons, expired licenses, dead bodies. Becker scrolled, his heart sinking. He tried adding missing to the search. He tried adding deceased, but without a last name, without a date of birth, without a fingerprint. The man was invisible. The system whirred, mocking him with endless lists of strangers. Becker sat back in his chair, the throbbing in his shoulder a dull, rhythmic reminder of the struggle. He looked at the empty doorway, then out the window at the dark, silent forest. He realized then why Michael had been so calm on the drive back. He wasn't surrendering. He knew that as long as he didn't go inside that station, as long as he didn't get fingerprinted, he was still a ghost. Becker had tried to save a life, but in the end, he was left with nothing but a phantom pain in his shoulder and a first name that belonged to half the world. And as the wind picked up outside, rustling the trees where the man had vanished, Becker knew he would never know who he had really pulled off that cliff. The man was already dead on paper, and now he was gone for good.